I'd like to talk to you in this discussion about two poems, sonnets actually, that are very closely interconnected in two important ways. First, in terms of intertextuality, these two sonnets have a lot in common with each other and with a preceding set of sonnets and values that come before them actually by maybe 500-600 years. Secondly, they are a great example of the evolution of literary form over time and how form, which is a kind of intertextuality, is adapted, modified for new purposes, reconstituted, and basically served up again in a new environment. And it's very exciting. The two poems we're going to look at, the first is a sonnet by William Shakespeare. The second is a sonnet by a very little known poet by the name of Edward Lord Herbert of Cherbury. Not very many people know of him. I wrote a master's thesis on him myself. That's how I know about him. But these two poems are very compelling because they both echo back several hundred years to the great poet Petrarch. I want to say, before I get into this discussion, just a little bit about allusions and intertextuality and earlier references in form when poets begin something new. And elsewhere in this course, I've talked about what I call the dialectic between conformity and innovation. And so any literary author who is going to produce something needs to be aware of the particular genre and form in which they're writing. And they need to make some decisions about whether or not they are going to conform to the expectations and tropes of that genre or form, and to what extent they are going to rebel against them. If they conform too much, too deeply, in too sustained a way, the work becomes cliched and not interesting. If they stray too far away from the form or the expectations of the genre, it doesn't look like that anymore. There are examples, for instance, of the 1950s, 1960s musical composer by the name of John Cage. You should go and look at some of his symphonies. They are sounds of a washing machine and running water and ice, and he calls it a symphony because it's orchestrated, synchronized collection of sounds, but to our ear it doesn't seem to be even music. And the reason I'm making this point is because if you don't know about the precedence of a particular literary text, you're going to miss out completely on, number one, the intertextuality, and number two, you're going to miss out on the origins of the form and what has been exchanged and modified from the past. If you don't know about it, it goes right over your head. And so to a certain extent, all of this business about intertextuality and the evolution of form over time are dependent on the reader's knowledge. And just a very brief anecdote to explain this to you. I had a colleague years ago at York by the name of Peter Mitchell. He's a Caucasian born and raised in China, completely fluent in Mandarin. And we were going for lunch one day, and so I went to his office and he happened to be on the phone. He flagged me in, take a seat, and I waited till he got off the call. Now, in every other professor's office at York University, when I walk into their office and I look at their library, there are always many, many books that I recognize that I've either read myself or I know of or have heard of before. I'm sitting in Professor Mitchell's office. Everything is from ancient China, medieval China, Renaissance China. The only author I recognized was Confucius. Everything else I had never even heard of before. And in that moment, I realized that, I don't mean this to sound arrogantly, but for all the years that I spent studying in my field of expertise, it was a drop in the bucket compared to what he knew. And so The point is that we are all, even no matter how educated we are all limited in the texts and the literature that we know that we bring to a reading of a new literary work. And that limitation can actually shape or define things. Anyway, we're going to take a look at these two guys. They're roughly contemporary. They're about 19 years apart. Shakespeare born in 1564, and Herbert, just to check my date, 1583. Herbert lives a lot longer than Shakespeare, but they're roughly contemporary. Okay. So these two poems have their roots in Petrarch. I've talked about Petrarch in another discussion on the origins of the sonnet. I'm just going to recap it very quickly. So Petrarch, remember, the ideal feminine, he writes his sonnets to Laura. She is the sort of epitome of feminine beauty, fair skin, blue eyes, blonde hair. Another cliche or trope from Petrarch is that the poet uses his power of words to persuade her, and the poet is also consoled because the woman to whom he's addressing the poetry is married, not available, but interested in him sexually, and not about to yield, but he is still very interested in pursuing her. So the rest of this analogy seems pretty clear. For Petrarch's poems, blonde hair equals gold or sunshine. That's one particular metaphor. White skin is ivory or alabaster. Blushing cheeks are damasked roses. Damask means a combination of red and white blended together. Blue eyes of Laura are like the heavenly skies. The poet's sighs are like winds. The poet's tears are like rains and floods. These are tropes or figures of thought that recur in a very cliched way in Petrarch. And in both the poems that I'm going to talk about today, they refer back to these particular traits in Petrarch. Finally, one thing about the Petrarchan form is that it's like all sonnets, it is 14 lines, but it is divided into 8 and 6. The octave, which is 8, has a particular closed rhyme scheme, ABBA, ABBA. And in the octave, there's a problem or a question. And in the sestet, there are 6 lines of interlocking CDE twice or CDC twice, which is an answer to the problem or issue raised in the octave. And so there's this relationship between form and content. The Spenserian sonnet is like the Shakespearean. Instead of 8 and 6, it's 3 and 2 with a rhyme scheme. We see that the Shakespearean sonnet is also like that with a slightly different rhyme scheme, ABAB, CDCD, EFEF in the first 12 lines, and then GG in the couplet. And of course, remember that the Petrarchan sonnet, because it goes 8 and 6, there's actually 6 lines at the end of the poem where the poet has a long time to reverse or undo or respond to the challenges or the problems that are proposed in the octave. In the Shakespearean sonnet, because it's 12 and 2, you've only got the last 2 lines to contradict or respond or call back to the problem that's examined in the first part of the poem. And so therefore, by definition, both the Spenserian and Shakespearean sonnet have to have a lot more drama, because everything has to come down. The last 2 lines of the poem have to basically challenge or undo or answer the entire 12 lines that have preceded. And so that is a very critical point to recognize about the form of these particular sonnets. All right, so here is Shakespearean sonnet number 130, sometimes known as My Mistress's Eyes. And for what it's worth, there are some critics who think that this poem refers to perhaps an African mistress that Shakespeare had. I don't know, maybe not. But it's a poem written to his mistress, and I'm just going to read through it first. And then in this slide, I'm going to talk about the vocabulary and the meaning. So the poem goes like this. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. So in that first 12 lines, there's a kind of very negative description of the persona, the speaker, the narrator's mistress. And then the last 2 lines, and yet by heaven, I think my love is rare, as any she belied with faults compare. So let's go through just the meaning of the poem first. So this opening line, my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun, is a sort of negative allusion to Petrarch, whose sonnets often said, my mistress's eyes are like the sun. So in this particular opening line, we're getting the reverse of that. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. So my mistress doesn't look anything like the regular aesthetic feminine archetypes of beauty around me. Coral is far more red than her lips red. Again, referring to Petrarch, who would often refer to Laura's lips, red lips, as being like coral. And here this poet is denying that. My mistress's lips are not nearly as red as coral. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. And again, referring back to Petrarch, who would usually refer to the white skin on Laura's breasts as being snow. And don't forget, in Italy in Petrarch's time, if you were outside in the sun, you were basically a peasant because you had a tan, and that was one way to tell peasants from aristocrats. Because aristocrats could live in castles and homes and were protected, there was no problem. Their skin remained white, and it was a kind of status to have lighter skin. So if snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. Dun is brown. It's a browny color. It's also used in some contexts to mean shit. So my mistress doesn't have beautiful white skin. Her breasts are kind of a horsey brown. I'll unpack these words in a minute, or a shit brown. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. And this seems to be a reference to saying that rather than having the smooth, silky, blonde hair of a Caucasian woman, that my mistress has eyes that has hair that is kinky and wiry like African hair, and so she is again outside the norm of beauty. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. I'm looking at her face, and I don't see the slight blush of her cheek against the white skin. I'm not seeing that. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. So, according to Petrarch, Laura's breath was as sweet as honey or as sweet as flowers. And our poets here are saying my mistress's breath reeks. That would have been very normal, actually, for Shakespeare's time. Dental hygiene was not practiced at all. In fact, teeth were generally extracted as soon as they got infected. You may not know this, but the tradition of the bride walking down the aisle wearing a bouquet or carrying a bouquet of flowers comes from France, where they were notorious for not bathing. And the idea was that the scent of the bouquet would mask the body odor of the bride, so that she would smell more like flowers rather than body odor. That's why the French also invented perfume, by the way. So this notion that my mistress reeks, so that's a sort of scent. And if you look at the progression of this poem, it begins with the visual, like eyes, the color of her skin, then scent, the perfumes and the breath, and now the auditory. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music had the far more pleasing sound. Again, denying Petrarch's claim that Laura's voice sounds like music. Our speaker is saying no, my mistress really doesn't sound like music, the implication being she's kind of shrill or whatever. I grant that I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. So my mistress is not ethereal and angelic, but she leaves footprints on the ground. And then this turnaround, and yet by heaven, I think my love as rare, meaning as precious, as any she belied with faults compare, that my mistress, who is not the archetypal beauty of the feminine ideal, who is not blonde but dark hair, who doesn't have silky hair but has kinky African hair, who doesn't have sweet breath but has bad breath. All of these things that she is not are all undone in the last two lines. And so the poem moves like it's a extended insult to this woman until the last two lines take it all back by surprise and say, no, I think that in spite of the fact that my lover, my mistress, doesn't have all of these qualities, she's still more precious and valuable as any other aesthetic of beauty. Now, one of the things I'm doing in this slide is I went to the OED and I decided to just look up a few of these words to give you an idea of how important it is to use the OED when you're reading poetry or any other text. And so I just have a glossary here. I went to the OED, for example, and I looked up mistress. So look at all the meanings. There's like 16 different meanings to mistress. So it could be she's a governess in charge of a child. It could be she's a female head of a household. It could be a woman who has authority over others. It could be a wife. It could be a female patron or inspirer of an art. It could be a woman or a goddess or a female who has control over everything. A patron, a powerful woman, one who has owned something. Here, the owner of a pet or an animal. A woman loved and courted by a man, a sweetheart. Could be the governor, like a political ruler. All of these different things. A woman other than his wife with whom a man has a long-lasting sexual relationship. Could be a tutor or a teacher. A woman who is proficient in an art or a craft, or used as a title of politeness. So when you go back to this particular sonnet, that one word mistress has 16 different meanings. And so now the complexity of the poem has skyrocketed because we don't know. She could be any one of these or any combination of these or all of these. The speaker, who is not necessarily Shakespeare, by the way, could be talking about his wife, his mistress, his patron, who is the person who pays him money to write poetry. That would have been Queen Elizabeth. So all of these complexities are there. Then you go and you look at dun. And dun is glossed here from the OED. A dingy brown color, it says here, typical of the coats of donkeys, mice, and numerous other animals. Not really a flattering way to describe your mistress's skin. Of a horse with a coat of various shades of brown. Or also simply dark in color, murky or gloomy and obscure. So that's that. Damasked here means woven with richly figured designs. A variegated design is a sort of mixed patterns. And so I think the fact that the poet refers to his mistress's skin as dun indicates that it might be blotchy or something of that nature because it's multicolored. I'll just skip down here to rare, which is glossed for us here as something good or fine or worthy of uncommon excellence or merit. And so this poem is asserting that even though the woman who is being spoken of in this poem does not fit the cultural norms of feminine beauty, she is still, in the poet's eyes, extremely rare and very precious. So that's the first attack on this poem, where we kind of look at it by meaning. Then I went and I did something else here. This is the same poem, and I'm using a kind of metrical scansion here called syllabic meter. Not like what you did in high school, where you count iambs and dactyls and things of that nature, stressed and unstressed, but we simply count the number of syllables per line, regardless of whether or not they are stressed or unstressed. And Shakespeare is the master of doing this. When you count these syllables, it's interesting that there are only 3 deviant lines in this poem. Every other line is locked in at 10 syllables. But the first one is really interesting. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun is 11 syllables. It's called a tumbling line. And one thing you would have to ask yourself is, what is the poem signaling to us about the content of this line? The fact that you have a line that's supposed to only contain 10 syllables but now has 11 is, in terms of accents and speech, overflowing, tumbling over the top, meaning in excess, which of course is exactly the point of the poem. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun, meaning that my mistress's eyes exceed the normal standards of beauty because they're different. And line 4, which is 12 syllables, is called an alexandrine. And again, this is speculation. I'm just playing around with numbers here, but isn't it interesting that this line about kinky hair is really a very important line, probably one of the more important lines in the poem, because it signals the possibility of an interracial relationship, and that explodes into 12 syllables, I think really sort of gets to the power of what this poem is about. It isn't just about somebody falling in love with another human being who doesn't look like the normal standards of beauty, but it also points to interracial marriage, miscegenation as it's called, where you see it in Othello that the fear about interracial love and interracial sexual intercourse and interracial marriage was really deep rooted, and it was Shakespeare's culture was a culture that saw interracial couples as being deviantly abnormal and succumbing to ungoverned lust and passion, and they were terrified. Iago says to Brabantio in Othello, he says, there's a black ram tupping your white ewe, a very gross and vulgar reference to Black Othello having sexual intercourse with Desdemona, Brabantio's daughter. And at one point, Iago says they are making they, meaning Desdemona and Othello, are making the beast with 2 backs. And if you think about it, when a couple is making love, the only way you can see both their backs at the same time is if they're doing it doggy style. And so when Iago says to Brabantio, your daughter is being done basically by a black man who's doing her doggy style, it's intended to offend and terrify Brabantio, which it does. And so all of this fear around race comes down to line 4, and that's why I think it's 12 lines over the top instead of 11. And at the end, the second last line, the penultimate line, and yet by heaven I think my love is rare, I think is a mirror reflection of the opening line, that kind of redeems it by putting 1 extra syllable in there. The emphasis seems to be on the fact that this is really an over-the-top challenge, that the importance of this line is so critical to understanding how deeply this narrator loves his mistress and how profoundly he is committed to her differences. Finally, I want you to take a look at the rhyme scheme. It is, not surprisingly, a Shakespearean sonnet because it's by Shakespeare. A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F. And then the couplet at the end that has to undo everything. So this is a moment of both intertextuality, where Shakespeare is alluding to all of the conventions in Petrarch's poetry and Petrarch's time. And it is also an interesting modification of the content of a sonnet, because the content of a sonnet was supposed to be historically mostly about love and about being crazy head over heels with another human being, usually a single young man with an elderly married woman. Now let's turn to Edward Lord Herbert's poem, Sonnet of Black Beauty. And he writes this, it's not published till 1635, so it comes a little bit late, but we think he wrote it roughly in the late 16 teens or maybe early 1620s, so maybe 10 or 15 years after Shakespeare wrote his sonnet sequences. So here's Herbert's poem. Black beauty, which above that common light, whose power can no colors here renew, but those in which darkness can again subdue, does still remain unvaried to the sight. Wow, that's hard to get. It doesn't have the clarity that Shakespeare's poetry does, but he's making a point here. He says, and like an object equal to the view, that is to say, something in a painting that has got the right perspective, meaning I think he's referring here to a way of doing a painting. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, where it's a portrait of a face looking forward, but as you cross past the front of the painting from one side to the other, the eyes kind of follow you, or there's a perspective in the painting that is always the same and unchanging no matter what angle you look at it. So like an object to the view, that is to say in a painting, art neither changed with day nor hid with night, when all these colors which the world calls bright, and which old poetry, brackets Petrarch, does so pursue, are with the night so perished and gone, that of their being there remains no mark. Thou stillest abidest so entirely one, that we may know thy blackness is a spark of light inaccessible, and alone our darkness which can make us think it dark. Now, let me unpack this for you because it's a bit tricky, but once you get the hang of it, you'll see what he's on about. So, light and the physics of light is something that scientists in both Shakespeare's and Herbert's time were coming to understand. The full spectrum of the whole light scale, the whole prism, if you put all those colors together, you end up getting black. And so the physics behind Herbert's poem here as a metaphor is that black is a color that contains all other colors, all other common colors, and therefore black is an exceptionally powerful color. And by implicit analogy, black hair and black skin, dark skin, are also superior to all other colors because they contain everything. And it says here, so black beauty, which is above the common light, whose power no colors here can renew. There is no single color that can alter black. So you can mix green in with black, it's still going to stay black. You mix yellow in with black, it's still going to stay black. But those which darkness can again subdue does still remain unvaried to the sight. And so there's two implicit points here that they are allusions, they're moments of intertextuality, which again, as I said at the beginning of my talk, if you don't know these things are floating in the background, you're going to miss them. And that's one of the problems with studying intertextuality and studying the evolution of literary form, is if you're ignorant of these other matters surrounding it, it's going to go over your head. But here's the idea. The Renaissance concept was that anything to do with change was below the moon. The moon was thought to be ever-changing because of its 28-day cycles. The Renaissance called it mutability, meaning that the moon was never constant. It was usually thought to be under the governance of women, and therefore was fickle and could not be relied upon, was always ever changing. But everything above the moon was thought to belong to the domain of God, where things remain the same. So if heaven is above the lunar orbit, that's where God lives. God is perfect, God is eternal, God is the same over time immemorial, and nothing ever changes. So the moon is the divider actually between mutability and change below and constancy above. And Galileo got himself in a bit of trouble with the authorities in the Roman Catholic Church when, after studying his astronomical physics, he pronounced that the orbits, first off, that the Earth moved around the sun, and the sun moved around the Earth, both. That was heresy. But the second thing that Galileo pointed out was that the orbits were not circular, but they were elliptical and uneven. And that really pissed off the Catholic Church, because the Church's definition of science was basically theology. And the argument was, if God is perfect, God never changes. If God never changes and God lives above the moon in heaven, then everything above the moon must always be the same. Therefore, everything that is static, permanent, never changing, and always constant is like God, and everything that is mutable, changing, in transition is weak and inferior like humans. And so this stanza is invoking two things. Number one, that black is the color that is dominant over all other colors, but more importantly, in the first two lines, there's this metaphor that of the painting, where in the second stanza here, where an object in a particular painting stays in the same place in the painting no matter what angle you look at it. It's constant. And so blackness, this poet is arguing, this speaker is arguing, is never changing. It's eternal like God, and therefore by implication is superior to other kinds of beauty. Then we go to this part, and old poetry, of course, has said is Petrarch. So, are with the night so perished and gone, these old standards of beauty have vanished, that of their being there remains no mark. These earlier standards of, blonde hair, blue eyes, light skin, nobody buys that anymore. That's a standard of beauty that's gone. There's no evidence left that it ever existed. But thou, meaning black, the color black, still abides entirely one. The color black is eternal like God. Always was, always is, always will be. And so here's the attempt to persuade us that we may know that thy blackness, so the color black, is a spark of light inaccessible. What a great line. It's called an oxymoron. That blackness is a spark is so contradictory, because the spark is light. But this is like, I don't know, a black hole. Blackness is a spark of light inaccessible, meaning you can't fathom it. It's like God. It's infinite. And alone our darkness, which can make us think it's dark. And darkness, our darkness here, darkness in this case means ignorance. It's our ignorance about the symbolism of the color black that makes it makes people see it as a sort of inferior color. So I also have a glossary here of the words from Herbert. So light is glossed for us here as visible, having to do with eyesight. Light is connected with enlightenment and knowledge. The god Apollo, for example, the god of light and sun, is also the god of wisdom. Discoveries are light because we are enlightened. It refers to heaven, the illumination of the soul by divine love, and its light is traditionally seen as a manifestation of God. But what this poem is doing is turning all of that upside down on its head and saying, no, no, no. The real infinity, the real power of the infinite of God is in darkness, not in light. And so you can see here the OED says that historically, darkness is usually associated with a lack of moral or spiritual goodness, sinfulness, wickedness, evil. You can see that, and of course in Western culture, so much imagery portrays black or dark colors as being satanic or evil. And for those of you who don't have that pigment in your skin color, you need to realize how painful this is for people who are of darker skin, to always have to bear witness to the fact that their skin color is associated with everything evil or bad or negative or inferior. And here's a poem asserting exactly the opposite, that black is beautiful, that it's a reclamation, a reclaiming of black as a powerful symbol, not as a sign of these negative things of blindness, of gloom, of obscurity, or lack of spiritual enlightenment or ignorance. The poem is fighting to redefine black as a color of light, the real color of light. And so this is a poem in terms of its intertextuality that is adapting and redefining this meaning, this signifier of black, as something more powerful. All right, let's go to the next one. Not too much going on with the syllables here, except it's interesting to say that at line 9, it's truncated, it's one syllable less than 10, and the line says, and with the night are so perished and gone, meaning that these metaphors that Petrarch invoked and created are not only perished and gone, but the fact that it's 9 syllables instead of 10 kind of indicates that it's been diminished, or is that it inferior in some way. And here, that thou still abidest entirely one. This line here is about the permanence of black as being godlike, and that's why the tumbling line, it spills over to 11 syllables. It's more than the poem, the line can hold, and so is black more than any other standard of beauty can hold. Now, here's the punchline, buckle up. This poem by Edward Lord Herbert of Cherbury, which tries to reclaim black, is all against Petrarch, but look at the form. It's a Petrarchan sonnet. It's written in 8 and 6, an octave, A, B, B, A, B, A, A, B, and a sestet, 6 of 6, right? C, D, C, D, C, D. So the irony of this poem is that it is an attack against Petrarch and all of the values that Petrarch stood for and that his poetry stood for, but the damn poem is written in the Petrarchan form. So it is both an attack against Petrarch and an homage, a tribute to the Petrarchan form. It's so wonderfully contradictory in its combination. And just to remind you here, these are the basic differences, but you can see the Petrarchan sonnet is 8 and 6, and the Shakespearean is 12 and 2. And so you have this wonderful moment of insight where Lord Herbert is really, long before James Brown sang about black being beautiful, this is Lord Herbert of Cherbury in the mid-1600s saying, you need to drop your prejudice about this color and about this color as it manifests itself in women and in human beings and in all humankind. And so it fuses together anti-Petrarchan sentiment in content, but pro-Senecan or pro-Petrarchan sentiment in form. And it's a deliciously complex interplay of texts, of wonderful intertextuality, along with this interplay of old form and new form combined together. So I hope you find these two poems enlightening, or endarkening, as you will, and you start to understand now how intertextuality can begin to work, and you also start to understand how form evolves over time by evoking and embracing and simultaneously changing and readapting new versions of those older forms into something more modern. All right.